King Charles had signed countless documents during his lifetime, often under pressure and without hesitation. But last week, when Camilla's new foundation charter was placed before him, the monarch did something no one in the room expected. He closed the folder, pushed the ceremonial pen away, and refused to add his name. Days later, Charles finally confessed why, and his explanation transformed a private disagreement into a crisis of loyalty. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Camilla entered the private approval meeting at Clarence's house expecting a formality, not a rejection. She had spent months preparing the Queen's Commonwealth Family Foundation, a proposed charity meant to unite literacy work, family support, and domestic abuse advocacy beneath one royal organization. A foundation charter is the legal document that defines how such a body is governed, funded, and controlled. With the King's signature, it would have received royal endorsement, access to palace fundraising networks, and permission to operate publicly through her position. Charles opened the folder and felt the mood change before anyone spoke. The king had been told that only routine wording remained, yet one section gave permanent trustees sweeping authority over future appointments and financial decisions. He read the clause again, then placed the silver pen beside the untouched signature line. Camilla watched his hand withdraw. Her confidence broke when he looked directly at her and said, "I cannot sign this in its present form." The queen consort did not answer immediately. She had arrived believing the moment would secure her independent legacy, but his refusal now felt like a judgment delivered in private. She asked whether he doubted her causes, her advisors, or her judgment. Charles confessed through a documented account prepared after the meeting that the problem was not the charitable mission, it was the hidden governance clause, plainly, a rule deciding who would control the foundation, that could have moved financial and appointment power beyond royal supervision. The monarch felt the personal cost at once. Refusing meant humiliating his wife, and delaying work she believed would define her future. Signing, however, could bind the crown to promises he had never approved, and leave William facing an inherited power struggle. Camilla rose, closed her handbag, and left the charter behind. The door shut softly, but the question it created spread quickly through the household. Who inserted the clause, and why had everyone expected Charles to sign before examining it closely? But before the hidden clause could be understood, the private wounds between Charles and Camilla had to be exposed. And those wounds reached far beyond a single unsigned page. For the public, the refusal looked like a constitutional decision. For Charles and Camilla, it felt far more personal. The charter represented years of preparation, private ambition, and her desire to leave behind something permanent. His refusal therefore struck at the deepest insecurity within their marriage, whether she would ever be trusted as an independent royal force, or forever remain protected, limited, and defined by the man beside her. Camilla sat alone after the meeting, still unable to accept how quickly certainty had turned into humiliation. She removed her reading glasses and placed them across the unsigned charter, the legal document that defined how her proposed foundation would be governed, funded, and controlled. To her, the organization was more than a charity. It was meant to unite literacy work, domestic abuse advocacy, family support, and Commonwealth projects beneath one royal identity, giving her a legacy that could stand on its own. Charles remained in the adjoining study, but victory was the last thing he felt. The king understood why the project mattered, yet the sovereign, the reigning monarch responsible for institutions using the crown's name, could not ignore risks hidden inside its structure. He knew his refusal had reopened Camilla's oldest fear, that she would always be accepted conditionally, praised when useful, but restrained whenever she tried to build something independent. William received the news in a private briefing and chose his response with unusual care. The prince asked who had approved the proposed leadership structure before saying anything about the refusal itself. His hesitation suggested that concerns had reached him earlier, and Charles noticed it immediately. William did not accuse Camilla, but he warned that a foundation carrying royal authority could not be controlled by people the future king had never approved. Sophie learned something even more troubling during a recorded conversation with a senior household advisor. The trusted confidant discovered that several trustees had been added during a late revision, despite the original planning group approving a smaller and more limited board. She read the names twice, then asked why Camilla had not been told that the foundation's control had changed so dramatically. Charles finally admitted, in a documented account prepared after the crisis, that his doubts had begun before the signing room fell silent. Weeks earlier, at a royal gathering, a promise had been made in Camilla's name, one that appeared to guarantee influence no charter had yet authorized. Camilla had believed the event proved her growing authority, while Charles left it fearing that affection itself had been mistaken for permanent royal permission. That promise, spoken before a room of powerful donors, became the precise moment when a charitable dream began turning into a royal warning. Every crisis has one moment that appears harmless, until history looks back and recognizes it as the beginning. For this dispute, that moment came 3 weeks before the unsigned charter, during a private fundraising reception at St. James's Palace. Camilla believed she was reassuring supporters. Charles heard something else entirely, a promise of influence, access, and permanence that no royal foundation had yet been authorized to give. Camilla entered the St. James's Palace Commonwealth family's reception, determined to prove that her project already had purpose and momentum. The reception brought together donors, charity executives, and selected royal advisors before the charter had received final approval. A royal charter, in plain terms, is the formal document that gives an organization its powers, rules, and recognized connection to the crown. Until Charles signed it, every promise remained conditional. Charles arrived only for the closing remarks and expected restraint. The king believed his wife would describe a limited charitable initiative still awaiting sovereign consent, meaning the monarch's final legal approval. Instead, the queen consort spoke with rising emotion about protecting families, supporting literacy, and building work that would survive changing seasons inside the royal household. Then she made the promise that froze him near the rear doorway. The foundation would remain protected by her office, regardless of future changes within the household. The monarch heard permanence where the room heard reassurance. He understood at once that those words could be interpreted as authority, extending beyond his reign. Camilla saw encouragement in the donor's applause, but he saw a commitment his successor might be forced to honor. She believed she had strengthened her legacy. Charles feared she had placed royal power behind a future no one had approved. A senior advisor approached him after the reception and handed over a revised briefing note. Charles read that the proposed board could appoint its own successors without renewed approval from the sovereign. That meant control might pass from one private group to another, while still carrying the prestige of the monarchy. Inside the car, the king folded the note once and asked why the language presented to donors differed from the version previously shown to him. Camilla later learned through a documented account of the journey that Charles had ordered the full charter brought directly to his desk. She took the demand as mistrust, not protection. He viewed it as the only barrier between a generous mission and an unchecked institution. That order began the review that ended with the silver pen being pushed away. When husband and wife finally faced each other without speeches, donors, or advisors between them, the argument was no longer about procedure. It was about betrayal. The confrontation did not begin with shouting. It began with a door closing. Charles and Camilla stood alone inside a private sitting room, the rejected charter resting between them like evidence neither could escape. She demanded to know why he had embarrassed her. He asked why commitments had been made before his approval. Then one sentence shattered the restraint between them. "You should have asked me first." Camilla had requested the meeting herself and ordered every secretary, legal advisor, and household official to remain outside. She wanted no witnesses and no carefully prepared excuses. Charles arrived carrying the revised charter, its most troubling passages marked by hand. A succession clause, in plain language, is a rule deciding what happens when one monarch is replaced by the next. For him, that issue made the dispute far larger than one charitable launch. The queen consort accused him of allowing old public suspicion to enter their marriage. She said people had questioned her motives for decades, and now her husband seemed to be doing the same. Camilla believed trust should have mattered more than technical warnings. Charles felt the accusation strike deeply, but the king refused to retreat. He told her that love could not demand silence from a sovereign when royal influence was being promised without clear limits. The monarch opened the charter and pointed to a clause allowing trustees to continue using royal household contacts after a change of reign. Those contacts meant access to palace staff, donor networks, and official relationships built through the crown. Camilla rose so quickly that her chair scraped across the floor. She stared at the marked passage, then insisted she had never approved that wording and had never been shown its full effect. Charles remained seated, but his anger shifted. The possibility was now impossible to ignore. Someone inside the planning group may have widened the foundation's authority while leaving Camilla to carry the public responsibility. She demanded to know who had changed it. He answered that he did not yet know, but a documented legal review had already been ordered to trace every revision and every signature attached to the process. The Queen heard investigation as another delay, while Charles saw it as the only way to protect them both. He promised to identify who approved the final language, yet he refused to reverse his decision. The charter would remain unsigned until royal legal authority had examined every power hidden inside it. The argument had exposed the hurt, but the marked pages revealed something colder. The real power struggle was hidden inside the foundation's structure. Royal power is rarely exercised through dramatic declarations. More often, it hides inside carefully written sentences. The clause Charles feared contained no threat, accusation, or scandalous confession, yet its effect was enormous. It could have allowed Camilla's foundation to preserve royal privileges beyond his lifetime, creating an independent center of influence that a future monarch might struggle to control, or might be forced to dismantle publicly. Charles listened as palace legal advisors explained the danger line by line. A governance clause is the rule that decides who controls an organization, chooses its leaders, and protects its authority. This one gave the foundation's permanent board broad power to appoint future trustees and preserve selected relationships with royal residences and patronage networks. Those networks connected charities to donors, palace staff, and public influence, which meant the clause could keep royal access alive even after the reign changed. William studied the marked passage without speaking. The prince understood that opposing it could make him appear hostile toward Camilla, yet accepting it could limit his authority when he became king. Charles's signature would count as sovereign approval, the formal consent of the reigning monarch, and any later attempt to remove those privileges could be presented as the son breaking his father's promise. Sophie felt sympathy for the Queen, but concern replaced it when she recognized several advisors named in the supporting papers. The trusted confidant had heard those same figures argue for expanding Camilla's independent public role. She asked whether they had designed the clause to protect the charity or to create a permanent power base around it. Charles did not answer immediately, but his silence told her the question had already reached him. William finally closed the legal file and chose his words with painful care. He told the king that the charter did not merely establish a charity, it created an inherited obligation for the next reign. The future king could support Camilla's causes, he said, but he could not inherit private promises disguised as permanent royal duties. Charles then revealed through a documented account of the legal meeting why he had pushed the pen away. The monarch would not allow affection for his wife to bind his son to an arrangement William had never accepted. That decision gave him moral certainty, but it also carried a brutal cost. For Charles, protecting the future now meant allowing the present to break there in front of everyone. Donors would hesitate, trustees would retreat, staff would realize the launch had lost the crown's protection. Once the refusal moved beyond the private rooms, the foundation began losing more than a signature, and Camilla was forced to watch her imagined legacy unravel in real time. The first consequences arrived quietly. A meeting disappeared from the calendar. A donor postponed a pledge. A senior trustee requested clarification in writing. By midday, the project Camilla had spent months building was no longer preparing for launch. It was fighting to survive. Yet the most painful blow came when she realized the palace had not merely delayed the foundation. It had frozen every privilege dependent upon Charles's missing signature. Camilla received the cancellation notice while preparing for another engagement. She read it twice, placed it beside her handbag, and asked her aide to leave the room. The royal household had suspended the public launch, removed the announcement from the engagement schedule, and banned royal branding until a revised charter was approved. Royal branding means the official names, symbols, and palace connections that tell the public an organization carries the crown's support. Without it, the foundation suddenly looked uncertain. The Queen remained alone as further messages arrived. Donors who believed the project already had formal backing began asking whether their pledges still stood. Several private funding talks were cancelled before lunch. Staff who had spent months planning the launch stopped making calls, fearful that every promise they repeated might now deepen the damage. She felt stripped not only of a charity, but of the dignity she thought she had finally earned. To Camilla, the freeze proved that her public role still depended entirely on Charles, even after years spent defending the monarchy beside him. One trustee then resigned through a recorded call with the planning office. He admitted that he had supported the wider governance language because he assumed the king would sign anything placed before him by his wife. The confession turned embarrassment into something darker. Camilla had been treated as a guarantee, while Charles had been treated as a formality. Charles received the call summary and felt his anger shift. The king learned that the queen consort had never been shown the final technical appendix, the added section containing the charter's most controversial powers. He had believed she understood every clause. Now he faced the possibility that advisors had expanded the document, hidden the risk, and left her to absorb the blame when approval failed. The monarch asked to see Camilla privately. This time, he wanted no legal team, no secretaries, and no language of duty standing between them. He needed to know what she had authorized, what she had trusted others to handle, and whether their marriage could survive the answer. With the institution temporarily pushed aside, the crisis reached its turning point. In the one conversation neither of them could survive through pride alone. There were no files on the table when Charles asked Camilla to sit down. No lawyers waited outside with replacement wording. For the first time since the crisis began, he spoke without the language of constitutional duty. He admitted that refusing the charter had frightened him because he knew how deeply it would wound her. Then he confessed the truth she had not expected. He had refused partly to protect her. Charles chose the morning room because it carried none of the pressure of the earlier meetings. The king dismissed every aide and left the door closed, deliberately removing the institutional barriers that had shaped their anger. A sovereign review, in plain language, is the monarch's formal check on whether a royal organization remains accountable. This time, however, he spoke first as a husband. Camilla listened as he explained what the final wording would have done. Signing it could have made her personally responsible for powers inserted by advisors who expected royal approval to protect them from scrutiny. The Queen had believed she was defending a cause. In reality, she could have become the public shield for decisions she had never fully seen. The confession broke something open. Camilla admitted that she had pushed the project forward because she feared becoming less important when Charles's reign ended. She had spent years fighting for acceptance, and the foundation felt like proof that her work would survive without depending on his position. The monarch heard the fear beneath her ambition, and accepted that he had failed to understand how deeply it controlled her choices. Charles reached across the table and turned the rejected charter face down. He told her he had not refused her cause. He had refused the trap built around it. Camilla lowered her eyes and admitted that urgency had replaced caution. She had trusted speed, loyalty, and applause more than careful oversight, and that mistake had nearly tied her name to powers she never intended to hold. The king then offered a way forward. A smaller foundation with transparent trustees, limited royal privileges, annual sovereign review, and no automatic authority extending into William's future reign. Camilla agreed to abandon the original charter. The Queen did not call it surrender. She called it a second chance. Their reconciliation remained private, But the vanished launch could not stay hidden. The palace still had to explain why the project disappeared, and the country would soon decide whether Charles had protected his wife or publicly diminished her in one brutal week. The marriage had found a fragile understanding, yet the country was about to judge the refusal through headlines far harsher than anything spoken behind that closed door. By sunrise, the private dispute belonged to the world. Broadcasters framed it as a royal rupture. Commentators debated whether Charles had protected the monarchy or humiliated his wife. Outside Buckingham Palace, tourists stopped beneath newspaper boards carrying the same striking image: the king's untouched signature line beside a photograph of Camilla leaving alone. One front page reduced the crisis to 4 devastating words: "The king said no." Camilla watched the morning broadcast without speaking. The Queen heard a presenter describe the refusal as the greatest test of her standing since becoming monarch's wife, and every word made the private wound feel public. The palace had confirmed that the charter was not approved, but it also said a revised charitable structure would be considered. A charter, in simple terms, is the legal framework that gives an organization its authority and rules. The careful statement meant the cause remained alive, even if the original plan had collapsed. Charles heard the same coverage in another room and felt the story slipping away from the truth. The king had refused powers hidden inside the document, yet the debate now centered on whether he had shamed Camilla. Some commentators praised him for constitutional discipline, meaning the duty to protect the crown from unchecked commitments. Others argued that the decision exposed how little independence she truly possessed. The crowd outside the palace gates gave the crisis a human face. Cameras caught one woman holding the front page above her shoulder, while another said the crown had to come before personal loyalty. Tourists gathered closer, reading the words aloud as though the verdict had already been reached. Camilla saw the footage and turned away. Charles watched longer, troubled by how quickly caution had been recast as cruelty. William moved before the debate could harden. The prince authorized a carefully worded statement supporting both the foundation's charitable mission and the king's demand for accountability. He made clear that any revised body would serve the public without binding the next reign. The future king's intervention calmed some criticism, but it also confirmed that the original charter had threatened more than a launch. Camilla now faced the final choice with Charles. They could retreat into separate rooms and let resentment define the ending, or appear united behind a smaller, cleaner foundation. The monarch understood that one decision would preserve pride, while the other might preserve their marriage and her legacy. The headlines had delivered their judgment, but the lasting verdict would be written by the decision Charles and Camilla made after the noise finally faded. In the end, Charles never returned to the original charter. The disputed pages were withdrawn, the proposed board was dissolved, and the foundation was rebuilt from the beginning. Yet the refusal did not destroy Camilla's legacy. It forced both of them to decide what that legacy should represent. Not unchecked influence, not protection from a future reign, but service strong enough to survive without hidden powers or permanent royal privilege. Camilla accepted that the Queen's Commonwealth Family Foundation could not survive in its first form. The revised initiative would operate under stricter financial, legal, and royal oversight. Royal oversight means the reigning sovereign keeps power to review privileges granted in the crown's name. The new charter limited trustee terms, removed automatic access to palace networks, required independent audits, and ended any authority that could pass untouched into another reign. The Queen signed first. She placed her name beneath rules that demanded transparency instead of permanent protection, accepting that credibility had to come from service rather than title. Camilla understood the cost. She had lost the structure she wanted, but she had also escaped becoming responsible for powers she never knowingly approved. Charles took the same silver pen he had pushed away the previous week. The king paused over the page, then signed without hesitation. He did not treat the act as reluctant forgiveness. He treated it as proof that their marriage could survive conflict when neither love nor ambition was allowed to silence responsibility. When he finished, the monarch placed the pen between them, instead of returning it to his own papers. William met Camilla privately afterward and thanked her for accepting the changes. The prince knew her decision had ended the threat of an inherited dispute and fully protected his authority. She heard no triumph in his voice. The future king offered respect, and the queen received something the original charter could never have guaranteed: a secure place within the family, rather than an institution positioned against it. Charles's documented confession made the meaning clear. He had not rejected Camilla, her causes, or their shared life. He had refused to turn the crown into a private gift for the person he loved most. She lost the charter she demanded, yet gained a legacy strong enough to survive scrutiny. He wounded his wife, but protected her name and his son's future. The monarchy endured because affection was separated from authority. The unsigned charter became a signed lesson. Love may stand beside the crown, but it can never be allowed to command it. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.